Good afternoon. Dracula was not the first monster movie. He was, however, the first monster movie star. There had been horror movies and even monsters before Dracula's 1931 release. Most notably the two silent films, the 1920s The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari and 1922's Nosferatu. Both products of German expressionist cinema, Caligari and Nosferatu were successful and well received, but neither had anywhere the impact nor the legacy of Dracula. The popular and critical success of Dracula launched an entirely new way of making movies. While Bela Lugosi's definitive performance not only created a lasting cultural icon, it also transformed centuries of mythology overnight. Vampire mythology occurs in virtually every culture on the planet. The idea of the dead returning to plague the living permeates our collective unconscious. In China, jiangshi are a type of reanimated corpse killing the living to absorb their life force, sleeping in a coffin by day. The Scottish Highlands are home to the Bayaban Sith, female vampires that seduce men and drink their blood. Bram Stoker, the novelist, spent years researching Central European vampire lore. He met Bulgarian varkolaks, Polish vampires, and Romanian strigoi before combining a suite of characteristics under the name of a particularly notorious Wallachian count. Although, aside from the name meaning son of the dragon, the historical Vlad Tepes Dracula bears no resemblance to Stoker's creation. In amalgamating the now familiar attributes of the vampire in the persona of an Eastern foreigner, Stoker captured the ideal of Victorian English horror. Fear of the living dead had a long and robust history in England. Staking dead criminals through the heart before burial at a crossroads was official government policy up until 1813. This tradition, combined with Victorian Anglo-centric mistrust of foreign influences and impurities, Dracula coded as foreign in a particularly Eastern European way, which is to say Jewish manner. He was the monster Victorians wanted and needed, conjured from their own fears, just like Invasion of the Body Snatchers would personify Red Scare paranoia in 1950s America. Dracula was a huge success. Contemporary readers, from all accounts, thought it a superb read and a wonderful adventure. It wasn't until the 1931 movie that Dracula achieved iconic status and became of interest to scholars. Dracula had already been adapted into a successful stage show and into a film in all but name. Sensing the box office potential of the story and wanting to avoid the torturous lawsuits experienced by Nosferatu's producers, Universal procured the rights to the story from Stoker's widow. They were one leading man away from shooting. In hindsight, it seems impossible to cast anyone but Lugosi for the role. His idiosyncratic, deliberate pacing and his archaic, heightened intensity are indelibly woven into the character's DNA. Bela Lugosi wasn't the first or even the fifth choice for the titular bloodsucker. Producer Carl Laemmle Jr. wanted Lugosi, who had starred in the role on Broadway. Good filming, good timing, and hard liveing by Lugosi and Laemmle finally convinced the studio. Journeyman director Todd Browning helmed the shoot, and from all accounts, it was a somewhat disorganized shoot, with Lugosi never really stepping out of character. He would avoid the cast and crew, preferring to lurk in the shadows, posing in his cape. Much like the Victorian response to the novel, audiences in 1931 loved the film and embraced it as a hugely entertaining adventure. Not until later, in the hindsight of decades, would it be embraced by film courses and scholars as a template for analysis. Since its elevation to the canon of essential films, Dracula has become a treatise on colonialism, an allegory for queer experience, and a Freudian parable, or any of another thousands reading. With the success of Dracula, Universal Studios would release herds of creatures into darkened movie theaters, establishing themselves as the monster studio. Dracula was followed by Frankenstein later that same year, then The Mummy, The Invisible Man, Bride of Frankenstein, and The Wolfman. And then came the sequels. Universal released Dracula's Daughter, a second sequel, Son of Dracula, starring Lon Chaney Jr., followed by Dracula Returned in 3 more films. And then there was the 1948 comedy about Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. This last film is the important one, and that's because it is the first ever example of a cinematic shared universe. Bud Abbott and Lou Costello encounter all of the Universal monsters in this romp, with very little by the way of explanation as to why Dracula and Dr. Frankenstein are hanging out together. Regardless of the vampire gymnastics, what begins here with Lugosi's ubiquitous Dracula continues today with the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and almost coming full circle with the ambitious but doomed Universal Dark Universe, an attempt to codify the shared universe of newly rebooted classic monsters. Beyond the vagaries of show business, Dracula's impact on the culture and how we interact with our monsters is the real legacy. Before Dracula and Lugosi, vampires were walking corpses, living putrefaction. Dracula humanizes the vampire and introduces seduction and sexuality into the mix. The vampire is now a many-faceted and tragic figure. Thus, the sparkling dream boys of the Twilight series, the tortured hedonists of True Blood, and the quippy redemption-seeking vamps of Buffy. Lugosi's Dracula is dangerous, clearly, but also charming, mannered, witty, and rich. The allure of the vampire is the same voice that calls us when we look over a high cliff. They are the cobra, and we are the bird. With this aspect, the development of pathos and resonance within the monster, we are drawn to the vampire in spite of, because of, our fear. So with that all in mind, from 1931, Universal Pictures' Dracula. Enter freely and of your own will.